French neo-colonialism is collapsing, starting in Africa. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Join me today. France's current crisis, marked by severe economic contraction, surging energy prices, and an extraordinary turnover of political leadership, cannot be understood merely as the failure of domestic governance. It is the visible surface of a much deeper structural rupture, the slow but decisive collapse of France's post-war neo-colonial economic ecosystem in West and Central Africa. For decades, the French political establishment relied on an external model of monetary control, resource extraction, and privileged market access to sustain its own internal stability. As that system unravels, the foundations of the French economic and political order are shaking in tandem. France today confronts simultaneous crises: a sharp decline in industrial competitiveness, a 40% surge in electricity prices since 2022, and a collapse in confidence in its governing institutions. 5 prime ministers in 2 years is not a sign of political renewal, but of a governing system struggling to maintain coherence. The public senses a more profound truth that France's traditional tools of economic stabilization have lost their effectiveness. The country's post-war equilibrium was always fragile, built less on domestic resilience than on a complex architecture of external advantages. To understand the present turmoil, one must look back to the late 1940s. After World War II, France was effectively bankrupt. Its factories were damaged, its currency was weak, and its colonies were pushing for independence. Lacking the domestic industrial base to finance a rapid recovery, Paris constructed a new economic model centered on the continued extraction of value from its former colonies. The CFA franc system, imposed on 14 African nations, was the core of this architecture. It allowed Paris to channel African foreign reserves into the French treasury, artificially lowering French borrowing costs and stabilizing the franc for decades. This monetary mechanism acted as a silent subsidy to the French state, enabling levels of social spending and industrial support that France could not otherwise have afforded. The second pillar was resource dependency, above all uranium from Niger, which powered France's nuclear-heavy energy system. Cheap uranium allowed France to become Europe's leading exporter of electricity and a major supplier of nuclear technology. For years, this external advantage masked the structural weaknesses of the French economy, from declining industrial productivity to chronic fiscal deficits. What is collapsing today is not simply a foreign policy approach. It is the entire external economic scaffolding upon which French domestic stability has rested for nearly 80 years. To grasp how deeply France's current instability is tied to Africa, one must examine the CFA franc system, arguably the most effective and least discussed instrument of neo-colonial power in the modern world. After 1945, with its industrial base weakened and its fiscal capacity exhausted, France needed a mechanism to preserve economic influence over territories that were rapidly moving toward political independence. The solution was not overt occupation, but a financial architecture that kept African economies structurally dependent on Paris long after the French flag was lowered. The CFA franc, instituted across 14 West and Central African nations, created precisely such a system. Under its rules, African governments were required to deposit half of their foreign exchange reserves directly into the French treasury. This arrangement granted France extraordinary leverage. Paris could unilaterally manage monetary policy, set exchange rates, and effectively dictate the financial conditions under which African economies operated. The CFA zone was thus not merely a shared currency, it was a monetary hierarchy. For France, the benefits were substantial. By capping African reserves, the French state enjoyed artificially low borrowing costs. enabling it to finance reconstruction, maintain social programs, and stabilize its national currency. Between 1970 and 2008, France is estimated to have absorbed over $850 billion in value through this system, money that might otherwise have financed African schools, infrastructure, or industrial development. Instead, it strengthened French banks, supported Parisian investment portfolios, and bolstered the state's ability to offer welfare programs that its own economy increasingly struggled to sustain. For African nations, the system imposed a permanent developmental ceiling. Exchange rates were kept strong to favor imports from France, while industrial diversification remained stunted. Local manufacturing could not compete with subsidized French goods. African economies remained exporters of raw materials, uranium, gold, oil, cotton, while importing higher value finished products from Europe. In effect, the CFA system preserved the economic logic of colonialism long after political independence. This monetary architecture also provided France with strategic insulation. So long as African reserves continued flowing into the French treasury, Paris could maintain a degree of fiscal comfort even as its domestic industrial competitiveness eroded. The CFA system acted as a hidden stabilizer for the French economy, an external safety net that shielded France from the full consequences of economic underperformance at home. But systems built on asymmetry cannot endure indefinitely. As African states began questioning the legitimacy of the CFA arrangement and seeking alternative partnerships, France's monetary pillar began to crumble, setting the stage for a broader collapse of its neo-colonial economic model. While the CFA franc gave France monetary leverage, the second pillar of its neo-colonial model rested on a single strategic resource, uranium. Few countries are as dependent on nuclear energy as France, where over 70% of electricity is generated by nuclear reactors. This reliance created both an advantage and a vulnerability. For decades, cheap and secure uranium imports from Niger, secured through political influence, preferential contracts, and opaque accounting, allowed France to maintain some of the lowest electricity costs in Europe and to export nuclear technology globally. This was the energy engine behind France's industrial competitiveness. Paris understood this dependency clearly, which is why Niger became the centerpiece of its African resource architecture. French companies, especially the state-linked giants Orano and Total, dominated uranium mining across the Sahel. The extraction model was rooted in old colonial practices, undervalued purchase agreements, weak royalty structures, and significant discrepancies between what was mined and what was officially reported. When Niger extracted 1,000 tons of uranium, only 600 might appear in the books. The remaining 400 tons effectively became untaxed profit-lost revenue for Niger, but a quiet windfall for French industry and the French state. This cheap uranium was not merely an economic advantage, it was the linchpin of France's social contract. Low electricity prices supported households, kept inflation in check, and enabled Paris to sell electricity to neighboring European countries on a large scale. Every year, tens of billions flowed into the French economy through nuclear exports, reactors, engineering services, high-value components, and electricity itself. Uranium from Africa subsidized not only French industry, but also the political stability France enjoyed for decades. Yet this dependency created a strategic blind spot. France assumed that its dominant presence in Niger was permanent, but Africa, especially the Sahel, was undergoing a profound political shift. Burgeoning youth populations, rising anti-colonial sentiment, and the emergence of new security partners, namely Russia, began destabilizing France's resource monopoly. When Niger finally asserted control over its uranium sector in 2023, it struck at the very heart of France's energy model. Orano reported a 133 euros million loss within months, and France's electricity prices surged by more than 40% compared to 2023. The consequence was immediate. France's long-held energy advantage evaporated, exposing the underlying fragility of its industrial base. The era of cheap resources that supported France's economic standing is ending, and the country has yet to develop a sustainable replacement. The dramatic shift in West Africa over the past 5 years marks one of the most significant geopolitical realignments since the end of the Cold War. What we are witnessing is not a series of isolated coups or leadership changes, but a systemic rejection of a decades-long economic and security architecture dominated by France. Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and even Senegal, countries long considered pillars of French influence, now speak with a collective voice that demands sovereignty, transparency, and a decisive end to neo-colonial dependency. For much of the post-colonial era, France positioned itself as the indispensable security provider in the Sahel. French troops, advisors, and intelligence services were embedded across the region under the justification of counterterrorism and regional stabilization, but over time the legitimacy of this presence eroded. African leaders and civil societies began to view French intervention not as protection, but as a mechanism to secure access to resources, uranium, gold, oil, and to enforce monetary control through the CFA franc. The perception grew that France maintained instability just enough to justify its military footprint while benefiting from the region's extractive economy. The turning point came between 2020 and 2023. Popular uprisings in Mali and Burkina Faso ousted governments seen as too aligned with Paris. In Niger, mass demonstrations challenged the presence of foreign troops and demanded sovereignty over natural resources. Young populations, now politically awakened and digitally connected, rejected the narrative that France was a benevolent partner. They saw the economic data, billions flowing out, little industrialization flowing in. When new governments expelled French troops, terminated mining concessions, and began renegotiating terms of cooperation, it was clear the old order was collapsing. France attempted diplomatic pressure, economic warnings, and multilateral appeals, but the political tide in Africa had changed irreversibly. These nations no longer sought hierarchical relationships. They wanted partnerships based on equality. This vacuum quickly attracted new actors. Russia positioned itself as a security alternative, offering training, equipment, and political support without colonial baggage. China expanded economic cooperation, financing infrastructure and industrial projects that France had never prioritized. Both countries presented what African governments interpreted as a more respectful and reciprocal framework. The most profound rupture, however, was symbolic African leaders addressing France directly, publicly, and unapologetically declaring an end to subordination. This was not merely the collapse of influence, it was the collapse of a worldview in which Paris believed West Africa was a permanent sphere of French strategic necessity. As these nations reclaimed control over their reserves, mining rights, and foreign policy, France lost not only its geopolitical foothold, but also a structural economic lifeline that had shielded it from domestic vulnerabilities for decades. As African nations reclaimed sovereignty over their resources and monetary systems, the consequences inside France were immediate and severe. What had once been a quiet external subsidy hidden inside uranium contracts, currency mechanisms, and preferential trade terms began to disappear. Suddenly, the French economy was exposed to the full cost of its own structural inefficiencies, long masked by the advantages extracted from West and Central Africa. The most dramatic impact came through the energy system. For decades, France's nuclear fleet was sustained by cheap, stable uranium from Niger. Once Niger asserted control over its mining concessions and began redirecting supply toward new partners, including Russia, the price and security of France's uranium imports deteriorated sharply. Orano, the French nuclear giant, reported losses not seen in decades. The cost of refining and importing uranium surged, and atomic plants that once enjoyed predictable input costs now faced volatility. The effect ricocheted through the French economy. Electricity prices jumped more than 40% compared to 2023, breaking a long-standing pillar of French competitiveness. For industries such as chemicals, aluminum, steel, and automotive manufacturing, where energy costs determine global viability, this was devastating. Plants that had survived because of low French electricity prices suddenly found themselves uncompetitive relative to German, American, or even Chinese counterparts. Industrial output declined, layoffs increased, and investor confidence weakened. Political ramifications soon followed. Rising energy bills and inflation eroded household purchasing power. The social contract, long built on affordable public services, stable electricity, and generous welfare, was strained. Public frustration grew at a political class seemingly unable to explain why living costs were rising and why industrial jobs were disappearing. At the same time, France's fiscal pressures intensified. Without African reserves flowing into the French treasury through the CFA framework, borrowing costs increased. The state, already carrying high public debt, found it increasingly difficult to maintain social spending at existing levels. Domestic tensions rose and political turnover accelerated. 5 prime ministers in 2 years is not the symptom of a healthy democracy. It is the sign of a political system losing economic leverage and struggling to adjust to new realities. Most revealing is that none of these crises is a temporary shock. They are structural consequences of losing a resource and a monetary ecosystem that had artificially strengthened France's economy for decades. What France is experiencing now is not simply recession, it is the delayed price of a development model that relied on external extraction rather than internal renewal. The dismantling of France's African economic foundations is now reshaping the French economy itself, exposing vulnerabilities long concealed beneath the veneer of European stability. As France's influence receded across the Sahel, a geopolitical vacuum emerged, one large enough to reshape global power dynamics. Into that vacuum step 2 actors whose strategies in Africa differ sharply from France's historical model, Russia and China. Their entry is not merely opportunistic. It is the result of years of quiet diplomacy, economic engagement, and the perception widely shared among African states that partnership with these powers offers greater equality and sovereignty than the old French framework. Russia's rise in Africa is rooted in the security sphere. For years, France justified its military presence through counterterrorism operations, yet violence in the Sahel grew worse, not better. Local populations increasingly viewed French troops as ineffective at best and self-interested at worst. Russia capitalized on this sentiment by offering a direct exchange security assistance without political preconditions. Whether through private military contractors or state-backed training missions, Russia positioned itself as the anti-colonial alternative, presenting its support as a sovereign-to-sovereign engagement free of paternalism. This approach resonated deeply. Governments in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger saw in Moscow a partner willing to recognize their autonomy rather than challenge it. In return, Russia's secured access to strategic minerals, gold, manganese, and most importantly, uranium, which further strengthened its position as a global energy and resource power. With Niger's shift toward Russian cooperation, Moscow gained influence over one of the world's most crucial uranium corridors, while France lost one of its most essential strategic assets. China's expansion took a different form. Rather than security, Beijing focused on economics, building roads, ports, hospitals, and energy grids that France had long neglected. Chinese financing, though not without its controversies, was perceived by African leaders as more development-oriented and less politically intrusive than European conditional loans. Beijing's willingness to engage African nations as industrial partners rather than just as resource suppliers marked a significant break from the French pattern of extraction. Together, Russia and China offered what France no longer could: alternative pathways to development, security, and national dignity. African nations embraced multipolarity not out of ideological alignment, but because it widened their strategic options. The Sahel's shift is emblematic of a larger global transformation in which former colonial powers lose their privileged status and emerging powers compete by offering more symmetrical forms of cooperation. For France, this geopolitical displacement is more than a diplomatic setback. It signifies the end of an era in which its national strength depended on unquestioned dominance in Africa. The new geopolitical landscape leaves France without its traditional external stabilizers and forces it to face global competition on equal terms for the first time in decades. By 2025, the cumulative erosion of France's influence in Africa had passed a tipping point. What had once been a remarkably durable neo-colonial system built on monetary control, resource dependence, and military presence was no longer viable. The question is no longer whether France's model is weakening, it is whether it is collapsing entirely. And the evidence points clearly toward collapse across three core pillars: economic, political, and strategic. Economically, the model's foundation has been dismantled. The CFA franc system, which once allowed Paris to draw on African reserves and artificially lower its borrowing costs, is being questioned or abandoned by nearly all member states. The very idea that African governments should deposit half of their foreign exchange in the French treasury is increasingly seen as anachronistic, undemocratic, and incompatible with 21st century sovereignty. With countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger announcing their intention to withdraw from the CFA system or reshape it under new regional arrangements, France is losing a central mechanism that stabilized its post-war economy. At the same time, the loss of cheap uranium and mineral access has fundamentally altered France's energy economics, exposing its industrial weakness and eroding its competitive edge in Europe. Politically, France's reputation across Francophone Africa has deteriorated more rapidly than at any point since decolonization. Public sentiment in Sahelian countries has shifted decisively. France is no longer viewed as a security guarantor or development partner, but as a legacy power that overstayed its welcome. New governments, whether civilian or military, have reshaped their national narratives around the rejection of French interference. This erosion of trust cannot be reversed easily because it reflects decades of accumulated frustration with perceived paternalism and economic exploitation. Paris now struggles even to maintain a diplomatic footing that it once held over de facto hegemony. Strategically, the displacement of France by Russia and China in key regions signals a definitive end to France's status as a great power in Africa. Moscow's deepening security ties and Beijing's long-term infrastructure engagement offer African nations alternatives that Paris is structurally unable to match. Without privileged access to Africa, France loses not only influence but also geopolitical relevance within NATO and the EU, where it once leveraged African partnerships to assert leadership. Thus, the neo-colonial architecture built after World War II, monetary control, resource extraction, and military dominance, is unraveling simultaneously. What France faces today is not a temporary adjustment, but the structural collapse of a system that sustained it for nearly 8 decades. France's crisis today is not an isolated event, nor is it simply the result of policy missteps or leadership turbulence. It is the culmination of a post-war economic framework that relied heavily on external extraction, monetary resource-based and strategic to maintain domestic stability. For nearly 80 years, France balanced its internal weaknesses with an external architecture that operated like a hidden subsidy. Now that the pillars of this architecture have crumbled, France must confront a reality it long postponed. Sustainable national strength cannot be built on asymmetric relationships abroad. The collapse of France's neo-colonial model in Africa is not solely an African story. It is fundamentally a French story. The loss of access to cheap uranium, the unraveling of the CFA franc framework, the expulsion of French troops, and the decline of French corporate dominance in West and Central Africa all point to the end of a geopolitical cycle. France can no longer rely on the privileges of a bygone era to lower its borrowing costs, stabilize energy prices, or assert global influence. The world has changed. France's model has not. There is, however, a more profound lesson. The erosion of France's influence in Africa did not occur because African nations suddenly became hostile, but because France failed to reinvent its relationship with the continent. While Germany reindustrialized, China built infrastructure, and the United States shifted its strategic focus, France remained anchored to an old model. This system expected loyalty without offering true partnership and influence without mutual respect. African states, empowered by demographic confidence, technological connectivity, and diversified diplomacy, walked away from a system that no longer aligned with their aspirations. For France, the path forward requires profound internal renewal. The country must rebuild its economic base on genuine competitiveness rather than on external extraction. It must reform its energy system, invest in industrial innovation, and modernize its political institutions to restore public trust. Most importantly, France must engage Africa and the wider world, not as a dominator, but as an equal. The era of unilateral advantage is over. The future belongs to nations that build cooperative, sustainable, and mutually beneficial ties. If France embraces this transition, the collapse of its neo-colonial model could become an opportunity for long-term renewal. If it resists the current crisis, economic, political, and strategic will only deepen. The choice is now unavoidable. France must reinvent itself at home or risk becoming a diminished power in a rapidly multipolar world. Thank you for watching.